It is Friday, May 5th. Let's talk PlayStation. Hello everyone, welcome back to another wacky episode of LTPS. We have some PlayStation stories to go over as always, and some that are not directly related to PlayStation, but still something that was interesting, which I'm sure a lot of you probably saw from yesterday. But let's dive right in with our PS Plus reminder. So the PS Plus Essential May games are now live on PSN, so you can claim those. But more importantly, this is our final warning reminder, call out PSA, grab the PlayStation Plus collection games on PlayStation 5. If you recently bought a console, your first PS5, you're a PS Plus member, grab those games. The program is expiring in like 4 days now at this point, so make sure you get that done, and that program will officially be over. But moving on to our first news story, Sony is finally offering Spider-Man Remastered a la carte outside of owning Miles Morales, which I cannot believe it took them more than 2 years to finally do this. I thought for sure they would do it much sooner, but the point is, when PS5 came out, Miles Morales was a day one launch title on PS5. If you bought the Ultimate Edition, you would also get a PS5 native version for Spider-Man called Spider-Man Remastered. You could either buy that, or you could buy the base copy of Miles Morales and then upgrade from the menu, but you had to own Miles Morales to get Spider-Man Remastered. Now they're finally offering it a la carte on PSN, $50, or if you have a base copy on PS4, just the standard Spider-Man PS4 disc or the Game of the Year edition or Digital Deluxe, then it's a $10 fee, as Sony has outlined before. Also, the PS Plus version, as expected, that's not going to apply here, so you would have to own Spider-Man PS4 and then pay the $10 to get it on PS5. But at least you can buy it individually outside of owning Miles Morales if you want to do that. Now, one big conversation point that came out from Sony's financial report shortly after, which, remember going back to last week, like it was happening during filming LTPS, so this was something that was published like 1 or 2 days after, but it was from Derek Strickland of tweaktown.com, where it was a report diving into basically the shift that Sony has seen year over year with unit game sales versus their generated revenue. So in short, fiscal year 2022 saw a reduction in unit sales across all physical and digital games, a total of 264.2 million during fiscal year 2022. Fiscal year 2021 was 303 million, and fiscal year 2020 was 338 million. So this is a sizable drop, though one that is currently still higher than fiscal year 2019. So when you look at the revenues, this has stayed consistently high. Fiscal year 2022 was $6.367 billion, slightly above 2021, but slightly below 2020, and greatly ahead of 2019's $4 billion. So the suggestion being made here is that the $70 price tag that many publishers, Sony included, has moved to may have impacted unit game sales. But in the grand scheme of things, they're still doing what it's meant to do, which is make more money. So less unit game sales, but making more money, or about the same money thus far, given the small pool of data that we have. And I do say small pool because that's what's, I guess, hard to do here, is come to some kind of conclusion about what may or may not be happening when there's a lot of, variables at play, not just the simple reality of the release schedule with big video games, right? What year is going to be more weighted with big games versus others, but there was also a pandemic, and it was also during a brand new platform cycle. So to me, I find that there's way too many variables at play here to really have a conclusion of, okay, the price increase that most publishers have done, that's actually affecting game sales. Now, I'm sure it certainly plays a role. I think it would be foolish to suggest that it's not playing a role, but given that the unit sales were still quite high during the pandemic, where we had $70 video games, it would be hard to say how much it's really impacting people, especially because as we're coming out of the pandemic, and for the most part, a lot of places have opened up, but it's obviously the economy that we're in right now isn't in the best shape when it comes to spending money. A lot of things have increased in prices, and so for a lot of folks that are price sensitive, it's simply cutting down on not just video games, but cutting down on a lot of things. So it would be hard to say that it's making a big impact when we just came out of 2 years of people not caring that we had $70 games and they were willing to buy those in droves, which Sony as a platform holder and a publisher, I mean, it's a good read to at least look at their financials and, have this kind of conversation. And it certainly is one where it dives right in, it dives directly into that ongoing talk about game prices in general, and there's always two schools of thought there where, it's the very obvious, and there very much is fact here, which is that, purely based off of inflation, games, yes, they are cheaper than they've ever been. In fact, I would also argue based on pure content alone, it's kind of crazy what you get for what you pay, at least versus, 20, even nearly 30 years ago now, I mean, where the prices have consistently stayed the same, even if you don't buy DLC, season passes. I mean, so many games nowadays generally are much longer than what you were paying for back then, right? But, there's that school of thought where it's like, yeah, of course game prices are going up. But there's the other side of it of, there's other ways to monetize games so they make a lot more money than they used to, right? Which is true. Or it's the simple fact that, hey, we recognize that due to inflation, games are cheaper, but it doesn't matter under any circumstance. $70-something, sometimes more depending on where you live, like nearly $100, more than $100. That much money for a single brand new game is something that I'm not willing to do, and that's also totally understandable, right? Everybody has a different financial situation. Having said that, I do think the one we'd have to wait for the whole generation to probably play out to maybe get some meaningful answers as to how that price tag is affecting the games business. But I would say that it seems like it's definitely hurting individual games more than it used to, right? When you have your next Forspoken, Callisto Protocol, your next Redfall, which is, $70, but also on Game Pass, that's also a pretty big title where it's like, is it worth paying for to own it, or that, you know what I mean? Like those kind of titles are probably going to be scrutinized much more day one versus how it's been. But even, it's for the longest time, day one titles have always gone through that conversation, but they might suffer more with all publishers moving over to a higher price tag, especially with subscription also complicating matters a bit when it comes to the value perception. But I would say that right now it's maybe a bit tough to say just how much is it affecting overall unit sales when people just generally are not spending a lot like they used to the past 2 years. Next up, we have a brief update for the PS5 Pro, and also all this other rumored PlayStation hardware that Sony is allegedly planning on releasing within the next year or so. And this all goes back to the one source, Tom Henderson, writing for InsiderGaming.com, where he did a report on all these separate items and the timeline that these devices have right now internally at Sony. So there's some new info in here, like, for example, starting off with the detachable disk drive PS5. Nothing crazy here, but again, Tom reiterates September is the planned release date or release window, and again, it's not going to be a proper slimmed down PlayStation 5. This console will principally be the PS5 hardware design that we're all familiar with, and that's the one little unusual thing, is that Sony typically by this point would start a proper console redesign, but they're not doing that, just going to be a detachable disk drive, which also implies that you could still use the same console covers, which would make sense and give those a little bit more longevity when it comes to additional colors and things like that you can buy. But the point is that is still slated for September. As for Project Leonardo, that's expected Q4 of this year. That's the only officially revealed PlayStation hardware that Sony showed off during CES 2023, but that's expected Q4 of this year. The new audio hardware, which would include a new headset and also wireless earbuds, those are expected by the end of fiscal year 2023, which would go into the end of March 2024, but we should have them by then. Then there's the Q-Lite Remote Play device. That's expected by Q4 of this year as well, so before the year closes out, we should have this remote play accessory, and that's something where, again, Tom outlines it's just purely a remote play accessory device that is tethered to your PS5 and the games that you own. So it won't be its own independent thing that can access PS Plus streaming or anything like that. just going to be like a kind of like a DualSense with haptics and whatnot, but an 8-inch screen on it to remote play PS5 games. Anyway, PS5 Pro. So this is tentatively expected Q4 2024, with Insider Gaming saying they can report with, quote, 100% degrees of certainty that the PlayStation 5 Pro is currently in development. Insider Gaming says the first dev kit prototypes are going to first-party studios in the next couple of months, and third-party by the end of this year. Now, whether you think PS5 Pro is happening or not, at the very least, we can say this is how it would go. It's very plausible because the specs would be at this point locked in if they're aiming for, holiday next year. But you would have dev kits going out to first party either now or very soon. And first party would get it first. They're trusted, they're in-house. It doesn't have to go through lawyers and all this stuff to uphold the secrecy of the hardware. And by the time it does get to third parties, that is where the likelihood will increase a lot in terms of it possibly leaking or us hearing more details. Conversations will definitely happen amongst a lot more people, and we should be hearing more. We would get more sources outside of just purely Tom Henderson at this point, which is perhaps the biggest sticking point with all these rumors relating to all this PlayStation hardware. But with Tom, to his credit, he's had extremely good sources relating to PlayStation hardware and firmware, and it's funny because it really depends on the type of source that you have, because Tom has still not heard anything about a PlayStation showcase, because whoever he is talking to or the amount of people he knows are not in that department or not directly related to the plans that relate to games and showing off games in terms of promotional materials and getting those things all sorted out, whereas somebody like Jeff Grubb, he knows some folks in those circles, and that's why he's hearing that there is a showcase, right? So it's always about the people that in these circumstances. But anyway, we're getting long on the tooth here. The point is, by the time the dev kits get to third parties, we should be hearing more about them outside of just strictly Tom. And with all this other hardware, it's something where when they're getting closer to eventually releasing and shipping these things, usually we get those spy shots from the factory or something. So it's up to Sony to, kind of get ahead of these things and make the formal announcements themselves to avoid the slip-ups we've seen in prior years with PlayStation, where we see these things before Sony is ready to actually talk about them. So I think the rumors will start to ramp up if Tom is to be believed, but if you are looking forward to a possible PS5 Pro, then that seems like it should be a little over more than a year away at this point. So I still thought it wasn't going to happen, but again, it's not necessarily following the same PS4 Pro timeline, so it does make sense. But at that point, I would be so curious to find out how they're going to price this thing, if they are going to be bold enough to keep PS5 at the price that it's currently at, and Pro comes in higher, which it would be a low volume machine anyway, but will they do that, or ideally would PS5 see a price cut to make room for a PS5 Pro at the same price PS5 initially launched at? Moving on to some updates for PlayStation productions. We have 2 new trailers this week. Really one new trailer, because I was mistaken on last week's episode where it was not a new trailer for Twisted Metal that was coming out. It was a teaser. And you can't really make any meaningful conclusions off of what is just Anthony Mackie jamming out in a car. And we do see Sweet Tooth for a little bit. It does look very Twisted Metal-y, and I guess the sort of tone they're going with, where it is a sort of action comedy thing, right? So there's that, but you can't really say anything based off of a teaser. Having said that, we did get a new trailer for an actual first trailer for Gran Turismo. I assume this is the same one that was aired during CinemaCon. And I think this was genuinely surprising, right? That was the rhetoric that was shared from critics before, but it really depends on what you knew about it prior, right? Because again, if you have no idea what it is, then you're like, Gran Turismo, how do you turn that into a movie? But it's about the real life story of Jan Mardenborough, who was playing the games, went through the Gran Turismo Academy, and then eventually raced real cars on tracks, and also had kind of a tragic moment in that story. And so there is something there that makes sense. And so seeing the trailer play out, like, you can get what they're going going for. And so I do think there's something there. Might actually be worth checking out, even if you're not really a Gran Turismo person yourself. It's just, it's cool to like see real PlayStation stuff going on in the movie, right, with all the games on the shelf, and he's legitimately playing the game series. But that's a story. So yeah, that trailer did quite well. It's like 9 million views on YouTube, which that might be because they're serving it as an ad and that counts as views, but I don't know. Either way, maybe that'll turn out okay. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with already, Sony is developing 10 plus live service games, and that's been a hot topic in the PlayStation community where, for a lot of folks, they hear live service and they check out right away because they don't like those kind of games. And so recently, during a conversation with GamesIndustry.biz, the head of PlayStation Studios, Hermen Hulst, he did acknowledge the image problem that some have with live service games, saying they're not making 10 different Destiny or Fortnite games. He was quoted here saying, "There is a risk that we talk about live service in generic terms as if it's a single genre or even a single business model. PlayStation Studios are making a variety of games that could be referred to as live services, targeting different genres, different release schedules, and at different scales. We are also creating games for different audiences, and I take confidence from our track record in creating worlds and stories that PlayStation fans love." Now, it should go without saying that they're not going to drop 10 live service games all at the same time and they're all the same genre. I mean, that much is obvious, but there is some validity to what he's saying when it comes to the baggage associated with the live service term. I do think a lot of people tend to, immediately think of like the big Fortnite, Destiny, Roblox, Genshin Impact type of games. Either that or the general idea that, live service, so it has to be multiplayer, there has to be a PvP element that I must engage with because, if those things are involved and you like single player stuff, then of course you don't want to be a part of it. Or it could be the general idea that the long-term content roadmap and the way they monetize the game could be highly aggressive and not conducive to a player wanting to, get into that experience for free. Obviously, it depends on the game and how they do it, but just based on what we have now, it's something like Gran Turismo. I mean, that's a single-player game, although you have to be online to engage with it. But Gran Turismo is technically a live service game. MLB could be considered a live service game. There is stuff like Ghost of Tsushima Legends where, the 2.0 version of that game is going to be expected, which you'll still get a single-player sequel for Ghost of Tsushima, right? So looking at what we have now, you can get a general sense of how they're going to be approaching this. They are going to do different things that don't necessarily have to appeal to a massive audience, although that's the thing, is that we're going into this with the understanding that Sony obviously would love for, one or two of these games to really resonate with a big audience in a way where it can become extremely lucrative, and that's why they're getting into the space, because you can have one ongoing game that generates a ton of money. If they can have the next sort of Grand Theft Auto Online, I think they would be quite pleased with that, and it could also, in theory, pay for 9 disasters. But you could have 10 games that come out and do okay with a healthy player base that also sustains the long-term goals for that studio and that content roadmap for that particular game. These are all possible scenarios that could play out, and there could be experiences that do appeal to somebody that primarily enjoys single-player games. It's something to be open. You should be open about it, right? So I'll always recommend at least that, but at the very least, you should also know we're still getting those single-player blockbusters that PlayStation is well known for. Now, I must admit this one is more of an Xbox news story than PlayStation, but I would be remiss if we did not talk about this because it is so fascinating when things like this do come up, which is the Xbox head Phil Spencer recently talking on the Kinda Funny XCast and being very candid, as he often is actually, saying a lot of pretty interesting things about the Xbox business. So there's a lot in there. Phil touching on the CMA block, the Redfall launch disaster, right? And so, if you're into Xbox and all those things, then you've either already listened to it, but if you have not, then I really implore you to check it out. But it's towards the end of the episode where Phil delivered some really interesting quotes. There's a lot here. I tried to include as much as we could to have the most context, but, he dived into the topic of Xbox's position in the console marketplace. And so he had a lot to say. He says, and I quote here, "We're not in the business of out-consoling Sony or out-consoling Nintendo. There isn't really a great solution or win for us, and I know that will upset a ton of people. But it's just the truth of the matter is that when you're third place in the console marketplace and the top two players are as strong as they are and have in certain cases very, very discrete focus on doing deals and other things that will kind of make being Xbox hard, for us as a team, that's on us, not anybody else. But we're not in a position, and I see it out there, I see commentary that if you just build great games, everything will turn around. It's just not true that if we go off and build great games, all of a sudden you're going to see console share shift in some dramatic way. We lost the worst generation to lose in the Xbox One generation, where everyone built their digital library of games. But this idea, if we just focus on great games on our console, that somehow we're going to win the console race, doesn't really lay into the reality of most people. Like 90% of people that walk into retail to buy a console are already a member of one of the three ecosystems, and their digital library is there. This is the first generation where big games that they're playing were games that were available last gen, when you think about Fortnite, Roblox, and Minecraft. There is no world where Starfield's an 11 out of 10 and people start selling their PS5s. It's not gonna happen. We have to go off and do our own thing with Game Pass, with the stuff we do with xCloud, and the way we build our games. Now, the thing is, if you keep up with the Xbox business and also what Phil Spencer has said throughout the years, this is not really the first time where he's outlined something similar to this, where, not only does he give props to Sony and Nintendo for their place in the market and also where they are in relation to them and how they have a lot of work to do, being candid about how there's certain things out of his control, like there's only so much you can do to try and capture more of that market share back. But also, even without him saying these things, the Xbox business has primarily been, for the last 8 years, doing things that Sony and certainly Nintendo are not doing, which is shipping on PC day and date, doing Xbox Play Anywhere, aggressively investing in cloud gaming, of course, subscription with day and date releases. And these are all things that Sony in many ways have toyed around with and, or they're actively engaged with these things, but they're very slow, or they're just not doing certain things like day and date releases, right? Or, not doing day and date PC stuff. You can see how Microsoft, for a while since Phil took over head of Xbox, how they're trying to carve out their own path. And that is the context of what he's getting at here. So depends on how you interpret what he's saying, but again, I implore you to watch the whole thing. It's a great interview. There's awesome questions being asked in there, and Phil also giving, again, very, very candid answers. But what he's getting at is how they just lost a really important platform cycle where, they're coming out of PS3 and 360. It was always something where you're carrying over achievements and trophies and friends, but that still might not be enough. You could switch platforms, but from PS4 X1 onward, now we're talking about consoles where consumers were buying a lot of their games digitally. We're going into very similar x86 machines with PS5 Series S and X, and so your software carries over. Some of your games that are live service titles, your progress carries over with native versions. So it's a lot harder to leave the ecosystem, especially when consoles do tend to have a lot of brand loyalty, right? And so it wasn't something before where if it's, just discs and cartridges, you can sell them and have a clean slate every new cycle, which was usually the case for a lot of platform holders back then, where, oftentimes it would shift in terms of who was going to be number one in the, real early days. We're talking about pre-2000s, but yeah, they're talking about how it's not just about the games and how there's so much more they need to do. And so, instead of playing the same game that Sony's playing with, being a very traditional console maker, carving out their own path and aggressively investing in areas where they can acquire more customers that, Sony or Nintendo isn't doing nearly as well, right? That's basically what he's getting at. And I do see the issue some may have with him saying, like, great games aren't going to do it. Like, what do you mean, Phil? Of course great games are going to do it. That's the number one way consoles, get sold and how you make money in this business. It's all about the games. It's always been about the content. Content is king. Now, I'm sure he certainly understands that. My only issue is that, like, we had a metric somewhat recently. I can't remember what fiscal year or what report it was for Sony, but it was the notion that Sony was selling a lot of PS5s, like 30% of PS5s being sold were going to brand new PlayStation customers. They never had an account on PSN. They were making new accounts on the console, and so they were selling a lot of machines to what appeared to be brand new customers. They could have been coming from another console. They could have been getting a console for the first time after a few years. Who knows? But they were reaching new customers. And so that is one way that, it sort of implies that there is still room to continue growing in this marketplace. And it's not necessarily always about brand loyalty and logging into an account with a deep history of purchases. And I'm sure he understands that as well. But I think what he's getting at primarily is them, finding their own place in the industry and something they can lead in that makes sense long term for the Xbox platform. Even if they do stay third place in console, they'll always, he even says Xbox as a console business is still the core tenet of what they're doing, and there's all these things that sort of branch off from that. So it's a very interesting talk. Again, I think you should go check out the whole thing to get full context on what he's talking about. But at the very least, I mean, whether you want to take Phil's word for it or keep in mind he's a high-level executive. He has to say certain things that may appear contradictory or unsavory, and he has had some contradictory moments throughout the years, and I can't necessarily blame him, obviously, for his position. But the point is, what we can say is that Phil is the only person that tends to show up on shows like these and make these kinds of statements. We don't get them from Nintendo, and occasionally we'll get it from PlayStation, but I mean, it's not like Jim Ryan is out here doing anything like that, right? So whether you like it or not, I do always appreciate hearing Phil Spencer talk about these things in what appears to be a very open manner. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it's very easy. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel, a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the news stories that I wanted to talk about with you all from this past week, and our Tuesday video was PlayStation box art, the history. I went on a 30-something minute long over-explained conversation and sometimes a rant about PlayStation cases and box art. I don't know why, but I just felt like that was a fun thing to do, and also it was easier to film, which gives me more time for next Tuesday's video that I'm working on right now. So that will be uploaded on Tuesday as always, but until then, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.